Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julia Bryan, and I'm the Global Chair of Democrats Abroad. I'm joined by Amanda Mohar, who's our Comms Director, and by Quade Williams, Deputy Vice Chair of Europe, Middle East, and Africa. As many of you know, Democrats Abroad will run a global presidential primary next year. Democrats outside the US will have the chance to vote at over 100 voting centers worldwide, and through remote voting too. Wherever you are, you'll be able to join in and cast your vote for the Democratic presidential candidate of your choice. To make sure that voters abroad have the chance to get to know the Democratic presidential candidates, we've reached out to each campaign team, asking candidates to join Democrats Abroad in a global town hall so that you can hear from them directly. This also gives our candidates the chance to learn more about the issues that matter most to you and to the millions of Americans living outside the US. We're kicking off our candidate town halls today with a conversation with Mayor Pete Buttigieg. He's in South Bend, Indiana today, and we're really delighted he could join us. Currently in his 8th and final year as mayor of South Bend, Mayor Pete won his first election when he was 29 years old. He was re-elected for a second term in 2015, winning with 80% of the vote. Under his leadership, South Bend has blossomed and it's moved from a post-industrial city into a Midwest data and tech center. Mayor Pete is no stranger to living abroad. He studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and he was deployed to Afghanistan as well, serving as a lieutenant in the US Navy Reserve. We're delighted to say that he and his husband, Chasten, have visited us when traveling abroad too, and we appreciate his interest in gaining a better understanding of our constituency and our issues. In our call today, we're going to be asking Mayor Pete to first introduce himself, and then we'll ask a few questions that address some of our top concerns as Americans abroad. Unfortunately, we're not able to take questions from the audience, but we'd love to see your comments and hear from you over on our social media channels. Mayor Pete, are you ready to take it away?
Sounds good, and thank you so much for having me. It's great to be connecting again with Democrats Abroad. I was a Democrat abroad myself, as you've mentioned, both as a student living overseas and as a veteran serving overseas. And from my time running for DNC chair and times when we've traveled and been involved, I've seen the strength of the Democrats abroad. The Americans living overseas constitute one of the bluest of the blue states. And so it's important from a turnout and organizing perspective that we make the absolute most of opportunities to engage with voters abroad and to make sure that every vote coming from abroad is counted. It's great to see some old friends who are on the call too. And I will be as brief as I can in opening remarks because I really want to make sure we're addressing the questions coming from the group. Let me just say that this campaign is motivated by the idea that even bigger issues than the emergency of the Trump presidency are at stake right now. I don't think a president like the one we have now could have got within cheating distance of the Oval Office under ordinary circumstances. And I think the moment we're living in reflects just how many profound challenges our country is facing. I believe dealing with those challenges requires very bold and ambitious ideas. I also believe that that can be done in a way that unifies rather than further polarizes the American people. And you will see that as a pattern across all of the ideas we're putting forward, from our vision for Medicare for all who want it, to an approach on national service, to what we seek to do about immigration, gun violence, economic growth, and each of the major issues that we're facing as a country. I also think that we need to organize our campaign and the next presidency around values that have been too often captured like they're the property of one party, but really can lead us in a very progressive direction if we take them seriously. I believe that's true of values like freedom, which cannot be delivered simply by cutting regulations on major corporations, but actually means ensuring that we build up people's freedom to live a life of their choosing with access to quality public education, good wages, and healthcare. And I believe values like patriotism that have been lately used as a cudgel to tell some people they don't belong are better honored by us being committed to American values, including the American values at stake when we speak up about our leaders doing the wrong thing, and are also honored when we consider national security in its richest sense, which means dealing with things in the 21st century that are impacting us, from cybersecurity to election security concerns, from white nationalist violence to climate change, that aren't going to be corrected by a 17th century security strategy like putting up a wall. For all of these reasons and more, I think that it is imperative that we have a new approach to our politics. And I also think from a strategic standpoint, we should remember that Democrats win when we put forward nominees who have a new set of ideas, often representing a new generation, and are not viewed as too connected to the way of doing things. I don't believe that a back to normal in Washington message is going to be convincing this time around, because around here in the industrial Midwest, I can tell you how many people who I think by rights ought to be voting Democrat effectively voted to burn the House down. We have an opportunity to deal with those fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is about. So with that, I want to make sure we're spending as much time as possible talking about the questions on your mind, but I'm so thankful for the work that you do organizing Democrats Abroad, and I'm thankful for the chance to join.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate that intro. And our first question is on a topic that we all care very deeply about. Amanda, would you like to ask it?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Mayor Pete, for joining us today. The climate crisis is a significant contribution factor to many conflicts and refugee situations around the globe, putting Americans abroad and all global citizens at risk due to political insecurity. How will you ensure that the U.S. will reduce greenhouse gas emissions below Paris Accord targets and lead the global effort to avoid catastrophic climate breakdown and the global insecurity it would cause?
So I agree, this is the central security challenge of our time. And my approach has three dimensions. It's a clean economy, it's investing in resilience, and it's US global leadership when it comes to climate. Now, there's a lot of talk about the first piece. That's where most of the debate is happening. And my campaign has put forward a plan to cut greenhouse emissions by, first of all, doubling clean energy sources for electricity by 2025, then in short order, ensuring that all personally owned vehicles are net zero emissions, eventually advancing by 2040 to do this on heavy vehicles and industry, so that by 2050 we have a net carbon neutral economy. Having said that, I'm pretty sure everybody's plan gets us carbon neutral by 2050 in theory. I think the bigger challenge is whose plan can actually get done, and how are we going to make sure that happens? And so in addition to the technical dimensions of what I think is required through R&D and energy efficiency and energy storage, in addition to the things that I think we need to do legislatively and with regulation, we also need to make sure we have a strategy that includes everybody as part of the solution. It's why you'll see an emphasis in my plan on things like rural America and how agriculture can be a huge part of the solution because of what we know about the potential for soil management and cover crops to be a tremendous way to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. We need to make sure that everybody understands where they fit and takes a measure of pride in being part of delivering a clean energy economy, because this needs to be felt like a national project on the order with going to the moon or mobilizing as we've done several times in the 20th century. I think if it doesn't feel that way, it will continue to be something that pits people against each other, when we are only going to be able to meet this challenge if all of the American people view themselves as part of it. We also know that a great deal of the challenge is abroad. Matter of fact, about 80% of the missions are coming from abroad. This problem will not be solved without US leadership. And it's depressing to look at, for example, the G7 and see an empty seat at the table where American leadership is supposed to be, as effectively the grown-ups in the room gather to talk about this major security challenge. The problem is they won't be able to get it done without us, and we certainly won't be able to get it done without the rest of the world. It's why we need to completely change our relationship to the world. You can either resent or lead, but you got to pick one. We also got to make sure that climate diplomacy matters. So climate diplomacy is a cornerstone of international geopolitical efforts. It's one of the things, for example, that would get us back on the front foot with respect to a competitor like China. But climate diplomacy is only something we can preach if we're also practicing it at home, which is why it is so important that we invest domestically in climate leadership. I also think regardless we already have to prepare for the destabilization and security challenges caused by climate change because it's already happening. There is evidence that droughts and food shortages have already contributed to migration and conflict in the world, and that is only increasing. It's why that'll be part of our national defense strategy. The military is already there. The White House and Congress, not so much, but in my administration, we will have effectively a climate watch floor that is preparing for the security challenges that emerge, even as we fight through aggressive climate change action to make sure that those impacts are reduced rather than increasing from year to year.
Mm-hmm. And building off of that, looking at that collaboration, what do you think a US president can do in early 2021, independently of the cooperation of Congress and other countries, to respond to this crisis as urgently as possible?
Well, there's a lot of day one activities that we can do at the stroke of a pen. It won't be enough. We need the legislative and diplomatic pieces too, but we can reestablish the EPA's Clean Power Plan. We can signal that we're joining Paris and view that as a floor rather than as the end of our commitment. Another thing that I think is important is to unlock what's going on in local communities. So as a mayor, I've seen how many mayors in cities around the country and actually around the world networked together, got tired of waiting for our capitals to catch up and just began acting on the ground. So in addition to commitments like the Paris Accord, in the first 100 days, I plan to host a Pittsburgh summit of local leaders who are sharing some of what is happening in cities that have unilaterally decided to meet some of these goals at or above the Paris level and empower them to do it with federal resources. We know that a lot of the solutions are coming from the bottom up when it comes to climate. We can begin unlocking those even as we're pursuing the longer term efforts on research and regulation.
Great, thank you very much. I think that Quaid has our next question.
Exactly. About immigration. Executive orders such as the one exploiting the term public charge demonstrate that our current immigration system was founded in a shameful era of discrimination and bigotry, and that family members of Americans abroad are allowed entry to the US through a patchwork of fragile band-aids and weakly defended interpretations. Would you restore the principle of family reunification? And how would your plan for immigration improve the situation for spouses, partners, and relatives of Americans living abroad, like us, who wish to return with our families?
Well, yes. First of all, I am committed to family reunification, and I believe in the power of immigration to make our country a stronger place. The other side talks about their support for what they call legal immigration, but in reality, they're undercutting it at every turn. And there are particularly terrible consequences for a lot of mixed status families, LGBTQ families, and others who have been targeted by increasingly narrow interpretations of the laws that are on the books. In addition to the fact that we simply need reform, including reforming the quotas and the mechanisms for green cards and citizenship, and the things that are talked about more often, like protections for dreamers, pathway to citizenship for the undocumented living within the US borders, and the need for a modernized border that's managed in a way that's consistent with our values as well as our laws. We also have a bigger, I think, cultural conversation that needs to happen that reorients the way we think about immigration toward being a benefit to our country. Now, here in South Bend, it is a big deal to us that the city is growing because we've lost thousands of people over the years after the factories closed. But if you look at the numbers, if you took out immigration, we wouldn't be growing at all. We'd actually be shrinking. And what I've seen is that there are a lot of communities that need people. There's a lot about job growth strategies, not as much about population growth strategies. One of the features of our rural economy plan that we put in, taking a bit of a risk, but believing that it was the right thing to do, was a measure for community renewal visas to create fast track to green cards for people committed to living in areas that needed to grow their population base. And even in conservative areas in places like Iowa, when I've been campaigning on this, it's been extremely well received. And what that signals to me is that Americans get it. Congress, not so much. Certainly this administration doesn't. But Americans broadly understand the promise and the potential for immigration to make our country a better place. It's not just about doing people a favor. It is about how we enrich and grow the United States. And if we're serious about family values, then we have to have policies and application of those policies that reflects our desire on families remaining together. wildly inaccurate things are being said, of course, by this president, but also being echoed in political commentary about how family reunification works. But this is about keeping families together. That's as American an idea as I can think of.
Thanks so much. Well, our next question is a question that's the top of the mind for many of the people on our call today. And it's actually, there's two of them about taxation. Our taxation task force drafted these questions, but again, this is something that many Americans around the world are really focused on. So it's about regulatory guidance and what we're looking for from the Treasury Department to alleviate the harms of FATCA, which basically affects thousands, every American abroad who's trying to set up a bank account, trying to maintain a bank account. Will you commit to direct the Treasury Department to study and then implement new guidance that will provide relief to ordinary Americans living abroad who are demonstrably not evading taxes?
Yeah, it's very clear that this law has had a lot of unintended consequences for law-abiding Americans living overseas. And so I will direct the Treasury Department to evaluate those unintended consequences and propose improvements and fixes, whether they can be done administratively or whether it's going to require legislative improvement to the law.
Thanks very much. Amanda, do you have a follow-up question for that?
Yeah, thanks for that. A follow-up to that would focus on the fact that most Americans living abroad think that the time has come for residency-based taxation, the principle guiding all other countries' tax systems, and a fix for numerous unjust burdens on Americans living and working abroad. There are bipartisan revenue-neutral proposals to implement residency-based taxation that include robust provisions to protect the law from abuse of tax evaders. All we need is a moment of leadership to get this done. Will you be that leader?
So I believe in the principle of revenue neutral improvements to this. I do think that revenue neutral part is important because we've seen how much overseas activity is a way that high earners and corporations, two categories that I think most of us feel now are not paying their fair share, have sometimes taken advantage of. But I think there is a way to do that, that to be responsive to some of the ways that some, for example, multinational corporations or some well-connected individuals could abuse the law. There are ways that we can get ahead of that. And so I do support the principle that we should find a revenue neutral way to ensure that taxation is fair and that people aren't being hit unfairly as happens. And I remember with my very modest earnings, even as a student, discovering that I was liable both to British council taxes and to US income taxes and learn a lot firsthand about what's at stake there.
Thanks, and we also support the revenue neutral approach too. Thanks so much for that. Quaid, you want to take the next question on healthcare?
Exactly. In a 2019 survey of Americans living abroad, Democrats abroad found that 2.2% cited their reason for living abroad as affordable healthcare. These numbers include healthcare refugees who cannot afford to return to live in the US due to the high cost of healthcare and the threat of bankruptcy due to illness. Under your healthcare plan, will Americans currently abroad at all income levels and states of health be able to return to live in the US and receive quality, affordable, accessible healthcare for their families at a reasonable cost and without threat of bankruptcy?
Yes, and it's disturbing to hear that US citizens are effectively being turned into refugees, finding that they are unable to thrive in their home country because our healthcare system has let them down. And it's a powerful example of what's wrong with our healthcare system. We have published, I believe earlier today, in greater detail than we have yet, the details of how I envision a Medicare for all who want it healthcare plan. This is the first of several releases we're going to do that will go on to touch issues including the need for innovation and administrative improvements in healthcare and how to stay on top of prescription drug costs. The bottom line is that healthcare should be regarded as a right. And I propose a way to do that and make sure that it's affordable for everyone. Now, the way in which I'm different from some of my competitors is that I believe that Americans should be able to choose whether they want to be part of this proposal that I put forward. So the reason we call it Medicare for all who want it is that I envision taking something resembling Medicare and making it available for everybody to get in with subsidies for those who are otherwise priced out of it. But even though I think that it's going to be better and a better value than any of the private options out there, I'm not going to assume that. I'm going to let people decide. Because if people like me are right that the public alternative will be better, then it becomes a very natural glide path toward that Medicare for all environment. If, on the other hand, it stimulates the private sector to do something better than it's done to date, that's not a problem. The core principle is not that the government be the main payer. The core principle is that everybody get covered. It's just that I happen to think this will lead toward the public alternative becoming the main one for most Americans. And if we deliver that, then it will address the problem you're speaking about. And no US citizen should feel that they have to leave their homeland in order to be able to get coverage, affordable coverage that they need.
Thanks for that. Do we have time for one more question?
Are we done on time? Okay, sounds like it.
Great. This is a really important question to us. Our votes are really valuable to us. We hold them dearly, and this is on voter protection. So while federal legislation provides some protection for our votes through the UOCAVA Act and the MOVE Act, the legislation just does not go far enough to counter the challenges that states and recently the Trump administration have set up to limit voting from abroad. Right now, 67% of abroad ballots were returned by postal mail last year, largely due to the requirements of different states. Yet, postal ballot delivery is really problematic. And during each election, thousands of ballots don't arrive in time to be counted. And then to make matters even worse, I don't know if you've heard about the Universal Postal Union Treaty, which we're about to withdraw from, well, we may withdraw from in October, which will likely lead to serious delays and postal mail price increases. How will you help protect the rights of Americans abroad to vote while helping states ensure that ballots are returned safely?
So thanks. This is a critically important question because so many votes are at stake, and it could have a deciding factor on the number of US elections going into 2020. I think there's a short-term and a long-term strategy. The short-term strategy recognizes the situation that we're in, and so I'll be partnering with the DNC, with other campaigns to make sure that we are informing and educating overseas voters about all of the different ways in which they can return their ballots. Obviously, it's a patchwork depending where we are, but there are a lot of places where electronic submission is possible. We want to make sure people understand those possibilities, and we'll work to get those kinds of resources for overseas voters on our website as well. I think tracing overseas ballots is critically important. And we need to make sure that, again, every vote is counted going into this election. Now, once I become president, there will be a lot more latitude to address this issue. And that's where we need to make sure that the 21st Century Voting Rights Act that I have proposed contemplates not only the racially motivated voter suppression we're seeing right here at home, but also ways in which US citizens should find it easier to vote and to register to vote, by the way. Things like automatic voter registration and making better use of digital possibilities, I think, are critically important. And over time, we need to develop election systems that are both more secure and more user-friendly than we've had right now. As you know, from living in various countries that have done this, there are a lot of things that can be done. Use of technology has facilitated forms of voting that are both secure and much less liable to ballots not being counted. And so I will task my administration with developing ways to do this and ensuring that states do not take steps that unfairly hinder any class of people from being able to vote, especially when it's with a view toward the political outcome. Because I think that one thing we're seeing is the consequences of a political strategy, at least in some states, by one side that thinks that they will do better if fewer people are able to vote. And to me, that's just an indication that your policies probably need to look. But in the near term, that's being used as a strategy, and we can't stand for that.
We totally agree. Thank you so much for your comments there. And thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to join our call and to dig into some of these questions that we deeply care about. Before we sign off, I know our members would be interested in finding out more about the campaign. We do have a webpage up for every candidate interested in accessing our ballot, and Mayor Pete's is at democratsabroad.org, Buttigieg. That's democratsabroad.org, Buttigieg. Mayor Pete, would you like to add a last word?
Sure. Just again, a big thank you for going through the uphill efforts of organizing fellow U.S. citizens overseas. And we are really counting on you to help make the difference going into 2020. I do hope you'll look through those resources with information about our campaign, that you'll check out PeteForAmerica.com as well, follow us online. And if you have a US phone, you can text my name, Pete, to 25859 for blow-by-blow details. But however you stay in touch with the campaign, I hope that we'll continue to be connected, and we're counting on your involvement in order to make sure that we do well, both in terms of the path to the nomination, which may well stretch longer than it has in my lifetime, which makes the activities of Democrats abroad more important than ever, and of course in ensuring that we replace this president with a better one, a Democratic, in November next year.
Thanks so much. And guys, we've posted some links in the chat box if you want to join and look over at his pages. And I just want to thank you again, Mayor Pete, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you in future candidate calls and at our primary next spring. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. And I hope that you all have enjoyed our global town hall with Mayor Pete as much as I did. Your support goes a long way. So after you've had the chance to visit our website to learn more about the candidate, then please do visit democratsabroad.org/donate so that we can continue to bring more events like these to Americans around the world. We'd also love to have your support as a volunteer. Next year, it's going to be all hands on deck. So sign up at democratsabroad.org/volunteer to get involved. New and first-time volunteers are very welcome. So with that, we're going to be ending the call. Thanks again to Mayor Pete and to all of you for joining our global town hall.
Bye, everyone. See y'all soon.